E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā whaunanga o te moana nui a Kiwa, tēnā koutou katoa, and aloha mai kākou from Hawaii. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this New Zealand Global Women Impact Series event, co-creating a more sustainable future for Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Amanda Ellis, originally from Dunedin, but now living in Honolulu with my American husband, and I'm very honored to moderate today's panel with such an incredible lineup. We have with us the first woman to ever lead the Treasury, Caralee McLeish, one of New Zealand's preeminent Māori business leaders, Mavis Mullins, and the co-founder of Catapult, which is one of New Zealand's top leadership training companies, Andrea Thompson. So the women who are here today, all members of Global Women, could not embody more the sense of connectivity that the introduction alluded to. As we acknowledge the Pacific Ocean, which connects us, and we honor the relationship between Aotearoa and Hawaii. The sense of connectivity, the importance of collaboration across sectors, disciplines, generations, cultures, and backgrounds. Sustainability as a concept is defined by the Brundtland Commission as meeting current needs without compromising the needs of future generations and the ability to meet theirs. And in 2015, sustainability really took center stage as for the first time, the global community came together and all 193 United Nations member countries agreed on a sustainable development agenda from 2015 to 2030. And of course, that's embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, when we look at what is happening around the world, and we look at the instances of climate change, we really question how is it that we are going to be able to maintain sustainability for future generations. Everyone's increasingly aware that sustainability is integral to everyone's agenda now for safe global futures. And in the business world too, we're seeing some pretty seismic shifts. The CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, a couple of years ago, declared the move from shareholder to stakeholder, followed by the Business Roundtable and the Davos Declaration. So I want to turn first to Caralee, the first woman to lead the Treasury and formerly economist at the World Bank, which is where we met. Caralee, New Zealand is one of a small group of countries really trying to advance an integrated well-being approach to the budget to underpin sustainable development, rather than just focusing on the very outmoded notion of GDP. Can you tell us about this new framework? What is New Zealand's role and why it's so important?
Thank you so much, Amanda, and tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. So here at the New Zealand Treasury, or Te Ao Ohanga, our vision is to lift living standards for all New Zealanders. We take a broad view of sustainability and of well-being, and we seek to lift well-being by applying our living standards framework and also concepts of Māori well-being in our work on budgets and in advising government on policy. So the underlying idea behind the living standards framework is that people don't want only material wealth. They also seek healthy lives, education for their children, a clean environment, strong and safe communities, and more. And so when we apply the living standards framework to public policy, it prompts us to be more rigorous by measuring human, social, natural capital alongside traditional physical financial capital that you see in balance sheets and income statements. And in that sense, it builds on traditional measures like GDP. It doesn't replace GDP, it enhances it. So the living standards framework encourages us also to look at issues that have also been underplayed typically in the past, like risk or resilience, distribution and equity across people, place and time or generations. It provides us with a frame for monitoring wellbeing outcomes, which we do through a dashboard. What we've seen in the Treasury in that applying the living standards framework it can make a real difference in how investment decisions are made. So in one of our early pilots, we examined a social housing redevelopment project. A traditional financial assessment meant that the business case was weak, it was unlikely to be funded. But when we applied the Living Standards Framework and were prompted to measure broader benefits like better health, safety, school participation, job creation, there was a strong case for investment and the project was funded. I also think that the pandemic has shown the importance of taking a really broad approach to wellbeing. We've seen that a focus on health outcomes helped to hold up economic activity. They weren't competing. A hallmark of New Zealand's response to date has been strong social capital, and like many other countries, levels of trust have held up and in some cases even risen. And the unevenness of the downturn has really highlighted the need to look at equity concerns in the response to the pandemic. And those are all dimensions that we look at in the Living Standards Framework. One of the ways we've been evolving our work is to better incorporate cultural perspectives. And so alongside the Living Standards Framework, we also at the Treasury now use Te Ao Māori, which is a Māori perspective on wellbeing. And in Te Ao Māori, natural capital, it's not one of 4 capitals like we have in the Living Standards Framework. In Te Ao Māori, the human spirit well-being sits within, it's inseparable from our natural world, or te tao. So obviously taking this perspective challenges us to weigh environmental considerations differently when we look at policy and when we look at budgets. Te Ao Māori also prompts us to look at key Māori principles, for example, tiakitanga or stewardship, whanaungatanga, connections. And so it's also an approach that is really helpful to us in considering intergenerational well-being or long-term impacts of policy on Aotearoa. Again, something that can often be forgotten in traditional policy work. So in last year's budget, we took some early steps towards embedding Te Ao Māori into our analysis of budget initiatives by identifying how those proposals aligned with Te Ao Māori principles. So, for example, the principle of kotahitanga or alignment, we asked whether an initiative demonstrated coordination across government agencies and alignment with government priorities. So what might sound something that's quite difficult to apply, we were able to make really practical. And right now we're exploring ways to expand how we look at wellbeing frameworks in future budgets and in major policy reforms. And it's about having more rigorous advice from the Treasury to government and to make sure that we align public investment with what people really care about, which is overall wellbeing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caralee. And it's such an enlightened approach looking at that bigger picture. And I hope a lot more governments follow suit. Thank you very much. Mavis, turning to you now as one of New Zealand's leading Māori business leaders. And I know you're very active in the rural sector. I was thrilled when you took me to my first ever Golden Shears event, and I won't say how many years ago. And you've also been involved in innovative new ventures, really on the cutting edge of technology like 2 Degrees. So as Caralee points out, the wellbeing budget that the Treasury is leading is grounded in Indigenous wisdom and Māori values. And certainly in my role as Asia Pacific Executive Director for the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation, we have a very deliberate focus on a grounding in Indigenous wisdom. Mm-hmm. I still remember when we were at the APEC Women Leaders Network together, and you pointed out that your business plan was 500 years. And at the time I was like, what? And remembering your explanation that you really needed to integrate long-term stewardship, kaitiakitanga, of the land and the responsibility to future generations. So in some ways, you've been ahead of the Treasury. Please share with us your perspective on co-creating a sustainable New Zealand.
Kei te mihi nui ki a koutou. Sincere greetings to you all, and thank you, Amanda and Caralee. It's been groundbreaking work you've been engaged in, and just loving how it's changing the mind shift. And the question you asked, Amanda, how do we as a nation co-create a sustainable Aotearoa? It's an interesting question, because I am going to say that for Māori, the answer's always been blatantly obvious. But it's almost as if others are too scared to see. You know, there's a resistance to see what what is right before us. And you say, well, why can't everyone see this? What's the resistance? And I guess I look at that and I think, it challenges our norms. And if our norms are comfortable, you kind of go, why fix it? It's not even broken. But as our global population increases and we seek to continue to produce safe food for the many, our waters have started to deteriorate, our soils are salinating, the seams to our planet are starting to unravel. I mean, that's the crux really of the korero today, isn't it? And so co-creation has to actually start here. It's got to be a mind shift. It's got to be a mindset and not shallow. We can talk these wonderful terms. We can articulate these beautiful values, but unless our mind actually forces action, it goes nowhere. We end up with a beautiful picture or a lovely phrase. So it's to put the environment and people first, because both have primacy. They both have primacy. And so that's a way of thinking that, as Caralee talks, it's connection. It connects everything together. It brings the ecosystem together. And I think we've got to be really careful we don't silo all this stuff out, because the minute we do, we challenge the balance. I'm going to really quickly talk a little bit about the Wanganui River. My whakapapa's in Wanganui, my heart is there. And of course, the Wanganui River is Aotearoa's longest navigable river, stretching for 290 k's from Ruapehu all the way down to the Tasman Sea. And I'm so proud of our ancient tupuna and our modern day activists who have lobbied hard to settle the claim that has given our river its voice. The interesting thing about that is, why do we have to legislate to give it its voice? It has always had a voice. So in some ways, these are the challenging discussions and concepts we have to grapple with as a nation so that we can start to co-create, because that's where the co-creation lies. The thing I love about the Wanganui settlement, it talks about the river, all its tributaries, all its physical and metaphysical elements, into this indivisible whole. There's some powerful words in that. I hardly understand them myself. I need to go and look them up. But, you get the sense of the power that this is actually trying to push out. That's the mindset change. There's the core of what we need to do. And I guess I just want to finish this little bit by saying, essentially, the Māori worldview in this that's going to be helpful for this co-creation of sustainability is understanding the conflicts, because there are, and we have to front foot them. The collective community versus the individual, planet or our environment versus profit, intergenerational planning versus Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. All of these conflicting methodologies or paradigms need to be fronted. And it's about us all being brave enough, and I'm going to say smart enough, because, it's easy not to look. It's easy not to look. So, for me, the answers are right in front of us. We have them, and they're grounded in Indigenous knowledge. They're grounded in Western science and our own science. All we have to do is have the korero.
And that's a wonderful bridge, thinking about that image of both Western science, Indigenous values, and as you say, not trying to separate things out, bringing everything together, which of course does create the need for new mindsets. And that's a perfect segue to Andrea. You're the co-founder of Catapult, and I know you're very passionate about lifting leadership capability. And you've told me one of your favorite professional projects is leading the Sustainable Leadership Program in partnership with the Sustainable Business Council. So can you share with us, from your perspective as an expert in leadership training, what are the capability gaps? What are the mindsets and skill sets that we really need to co-create a sustainable Aotearoa?
Well, kia ora all, and ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you, Amanda. And it's wonderful. It really does feel like we're in one conversation here, because as Caralee said, it's well-being of society and the economy. And as Mavis said, it's about seeing the connections between all these pieces and having a longer term view. So we do know there is a massive leadership gap at the moment. The Auditor General said that in the central government, they essentially couldn't find leadership of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the public sector, there's a leadership gap, and in the private sector. I know from talking to sustainability leaders in the private sector, a lot of them are feeling quite isolated and overwhelmed because this accountability is landed with a single person, and no single person can possibly solve it. But what are the mindsets and the skill sets that are involved? Well, because sustainability is of a level of complexity beyond challenges that we've faced before, it does require a shift in mindset. And as Mavis said, it's about seeing the connections. So it's really the sustainability mindset is one of seeing the interdependence of society, the economy, and the environment. And that actually the economy is a construct of society, and we all need to live within planetary boundaries. So a nice kind of nested levels way of relating to sustainability. And the skill sets are distinct as well. And the first one is what we call thinking outside in and future back. So it's being aware of the external world, things like megatrends, and being a longer term view, as Mavis has referenced, so more intergenerational thinking, and bringing that perspective into the organisational community to shape strategy. Second one is systems leadership, seeing the relationship of the organisation in its system rather than in isolation, and bringing those shifting perspectives of stakeholders into view. So we know from Caralee, regulations shifting, and it's shifting rapidly, but also investor preferences, consumer preferences, employee preferences are all shifting dramatically quickly to this world of sustainability. The third key skill set is really a repurposing of business we're seeing, where people are putting sustainability as central, sustainable value as core to purpose and strategy, rather than a bolt-on that's added on after core strategy. A fourth skill set is around the ability to diagnose complex sustainable challenges, and that does require a different toolkit of skills. And then collaborating, as Mavis has alluded to too, because a lot of sustainable gains involves working with your value chain and supply chain. It's making sustainability integral into procurement and working alongside your providers as you do that. And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, it's almost a shift of how you see leadership, from thinking you individually have the answers to more a model of leader as facilitator, a holder of space, and a crafter of dialogues who can invite in stakeholders who have very different perspectives and navigate a way forward. So they're the mindsets and skill sets of sustainability leaders that we're seeing.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm hoping that my internet connection is okay. Give me a sign if it's not. I keep getting messages, but I love that whole idea of outside in and the future back, systems leadership, complexity, collaboration, and thinking about leadership as actually a facilitation role. And all that becomes so critical when we look at what is happening right now with regards to climate. The UN Secretary General has declared Code Red for humanity. And the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the run-up to our next big meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow in November is really dire. So it's clear that it is anthropogenic. It's us, it's we humans that are creating this rapidly changing climate. And I think COVID taught us two things. One, how interconnected we all are as a planet. I'm not safe until you're safe. And New Zealand, and the way in which, the exemplary way in which New Zealand has really handled COVID is a great insight to that. And then second of all, exponentiality. It took 3 months to reach just a small number of cases, first million cases in 3 months. And now we are seeing hundreds of millions of cases globally. And so if we don't pay attention early, we know there's going to be exponential and disruptive change. And those in the tech industry, I can see Mavis nodding, those in the tech industry know that, right? There's disruptive change. So we have a guest with us in the audience, Florence Van Dyke from Cheer Sisters, who was a corporate lawyer and then decided she was going to step out and become an entrepreneur, and now is leading or co-leading and CEO of Cheer Sisters, which is in the top 5% for sustainability globally for B Corps. And B Corps are companies that are also doing good in society as well as making profit. So it's exciting to have Florence here. She's also one of the top 30 under 30. And in New Zealand, she is a co-founder of a new organization, New Zealand Businesses for Climate Action. So Florence, please turn on your mic and join us and let us know your perspective and questions you may have for the panel.
Thank you so much,
Welcome.
Amanda, for that generous introduction. And I couldn't agree more with the conversation here, Caralee and Andrea, and in particular Mavis, talking about Te Ao Māori and that Māori framework for sustainable business. So as Amanda said, I am the founder of Cheer Sisters and Businesses for Climate Action. And I deeply believe that businesses can have a positive impact on people and our planet. And in particular, businesses are the biggest contributors to climate change, so can be the biggest part of the solution. So our company, Cheer Sisters, it's a multi-million-dollar international health beverage company. My sister first founded it in 2013. And rather than waiting until we were a big company or until we'd made it to incorporate sustainability, we really tried to have that as a core value from day one. And I think that has been pivotal to our profitability and our success over the last 8 years. And the proudest achievement for me happened in 2019 when we started measuring our carbon emissions. We had a consultant help us understand our carbon footprint, and then we used that carbon footprint to reduce our carbon emissions as much as possible. So we insulated our bottling line, we shifted to electric vehicles, we reduced our waste, and we also lined our factory with solar panels to become New Zealand's first solar-powered juicery. So the panels in our factory can harness up to 16,000 watts of energy per hour, which is actually twice the amount we need to run our factory, so we can sell what we don't need back to the grid. And people often ask us whether the cost of the solar panels justifies the savings in electricity financially. And the short answer to that is no, but the question is really wrong, because when we shifted to solar power, we launched a new range of drinks called Bottled by the Sun to celebrate this new solar. And the income from those sales is already 20 times higher than the cost of the solar panels, and it's only been a few years. So really what the question should have been is it profitable to be ethical? And in this case, the answer was definitely yes. So once we'd reduced our carbon emissions as much as possible through that process, we offset the remaining emissions by 120% to become a carbon negative business. And most importantly, we really realized that the biggest role that we could have would be to influence and support other businesses to do this same thing. So we launched Businesses for Climate Action in 2019 with that goal in mind. And since then, we've spoken and workshopped with over 1,000 businesses to support them in undertaking this same process of measuring, reducing and offsetting carbon emissions. So through Businesses for Climate Action, all of these 1,000 businesses that we're working with are sharing data and resources, and they're creating solutions to climate change and blueprints for best business practice together. And I really believe that it's this entrepreneurial, collaborative drive that will enable us to reach a safe climate future in my lifetime. Kia ora and thank you.
Kia ora, Florence, and it's so inspiring for an oldie like me when I visited your factory in Nelson, and to just see what you've been able to do, but also this brilliant collaborative approach. I love the question, is it profitable to be ethical? And the answer is yes. As we approach COP26 in Glasgow, I was reminded by the UK Special Climate Envoy, Nigel Topping, that climate's not just an environmental issue, it is a fundamental economic issue. And he actually says any CEO who doesn't recognize that will be out of a job in 2 years. So love this approach. Is it profitable to be ethical? And the answer is yes. Now, Caralee, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is famous for the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that considers unexamined liabilities on business balance sheets related to climate impacts. And I'm so proud that New Zealand has been a global leader in advancing mandatory climate disclosures from the top 200 businesses. And we know that the UK and the Securities Commission in the US are following suit. What does this mean for business?
Thanks, Amanda. And it's a great question. And the New Zealand Climate Change Commission has pointed to a really large gap between our emissions targets and the current trajectory of emissions. We know that getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is going to require structural shifts, effort by business, public sector, communities. We'll need to electrify transport industry, change transport modes. We'll need to have more low emissions agriculture, more city design, and just big changes that are going to profoundly affect every part of our society. As you mentioned, New Zealand is making climate-related disclosures mandatory following the TCFD framework. It's one of many ways to try and address those big shifts that are required in Aotearoa to a low emissions future, alongside the emissions trading scheme and many, many other policies. But the practical impacts of the TCFD are that about 200 large New Zealand organisations, as you say, including banks, insurers, investment managers, they're going to need to start disclosing clear and comprehensive information on the impacts of climate change. It starts in 2022, meaning that the first disclosures will be made in 2023. The disclosures are going to cover 4 areas of climate-related risks, but also climate-related opportunities. And we need to remember that for business, it's not just about risks, it is also about opportunities as well. So what are businesses' governance arrangements around climate? How will strategy and finances be affected? What are the risk management arrangements that are put in place? And finally, the metrics and targets that businesses use to assess climate-related risks and opportunities. Look, I think it really is a significant development in business reporting requirements, which largely to date focus on those traditional financials and traditional risks. And the reason why it's so important is that it will help to shift capital and investment to low emissions activities. Climate change will mean that some assets and business activities will lose their value, especially the high emitting ones. But on the other hand, low carbon businesses, assets, technologies, these are going to be increasingly valuable, increasingly in demand. And at the moment, it's hard for businesses, for their investors, for customers to get quality information about climate impacts on their bottom line. So mandating the TCFD of climate risks and opportunities means that market participants are going to be better able to make the green choice, if you like. And that will help to orient investment and spending to low emissions activities and help to reduce New Zealand's carbon emissions. I would also just say that climate change doesn't just affect businesses' bottom lines. Working at the Treasury, we're quite conscious also that it affects government's books as well. We've recently prepared projections, some long-term projections of some of the fiscal impacts of climate change. We know that there'll be more severe weather events that could lead to some significant increases in net debt. There are likely to be big costs for taxpayers in mitigation, adaptation, transition support that's required for vulnerable groups. And the size and the distribution of those costs will depend upon policy choices, including how quickly we respond to climate change. And as you said, Amanda, there might be upfront costs, but by investing, you may have potential to reduce the total costs over the long term. Acting now is important. And while the TCFD doesn't apply to government, we are also looking at ways to more transparently assess and disclose climate-related risk for government as well. So we hope to be making some big progress in government reporting, as well as what's happening with the TCFD application to business. Thanks.
That's great. And thank you so much for your leadership on this. I think we often forget the downside too. There's been hundreds of billions of dollars of damages from the mega storms that we've been seeing around the world, and huge droughts. We look at the 1.5 billion animals that died in the fires in Australia last year. We're seeing fires in the Arctic now, and increasingly mega superstorms where there are really important human and economic impacts. So thank you for really being on the forefront and setting a pace for the rest of the world to follow. And it's a wonderful level playing field. I know that the Businesses for Climate Action is saying, hey, why not the rest of us? Why just the top 200? It does create a level playing field for a race to the top. So thank you, Caralee. Really, really grateful for the work that you're doing. Now, Mavis, Caralee mentioned agriculture, and we know that close to half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions are currently attributable to methane from livestock in Aotearoa. And I know you're a dairy farmer, among many other things. Tell us about how the climate crisis is impacting your business operations. And is there a divide in the New Zealand farming community over how to address climate change?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So first of all, we're 12 generations on this land that I call home. So on a daily basis, I walk the footsteps of my dad, his mum, her mother, her father, his grandfather, and so on, mai rā no. So for generations gone past. I've children and grandchildren who now live, play, work on this land. So this is not a job. This is a legacy. This is a mokopuna decision that we're enacting every single day. And I have huge expectations that these grandchildren of ours will have the same responsibility on them. So we have a small dairy farm just out of Dannevirke. My husband and I took this on about 12 years ago from my father and my brother who used to toil the land. So 10 years ago, they milked 400 cows twice a day on this 150 hectare property. Today, we milk 230 cows once a day on the same land. We produce triple what they did 10 years ago on the same land block. Our fertiliser use has been minimised and is certainly so much more focused than it was back then. We know our numbers. As a Fonterra supplier, we know what our carbon footprint is. We know what our nitrate leachate is. We know what it is that we have to do. And every day we do our best to make these systems more simple. So, things, better systems, better genetics, better science, better care, all of that sort of stuff. We've fenced all our waterways. We bound the Manawatu River, my sacred river. So we've fenced all of that off. We have a 10-year planting program. We constantly engage in weed control because we have generous riparian strips, which the blackberry and old man's beard just love. And we engage in research for best forage genetics. We karakia to our river. We give thanks to our land. We express love and gratitude for the environment around us. We want the best for our mokopuna, and that's what this is all about. So do I sound defensive as a farmer? Probably I do. And I don't apologise for that one little bit, because these stories don't get told. These are the stories that you don't hear. And we're not alone in this. There are many farmers who are out there who are so much more advanced than we are at the moment. There's some that are just starting this journey. I chair in Tararua a plantain project. Plantain is a weed. We used to spray it out. For Māori, it was a medicinal herb we call kupa kupa. And it was one of these herbs that's great for one side of the leaf for drawing out infection. And then once the healing starts, the other side of the leaf had healing properties. So now we know through science that this plant, plantain, is able to mitigate leachate in the soil. Not only that, it's magical because within the actual stomach of the cow, and I'm going to be very crude, but I'll just say it like it is, it does something to the metabolic so that cows don't fart as much. So methane is managed a lot better. Now, you know, I often hear the other side of the coin where there's all these uninformed judgments on farmers, where there's wholesale blame, where there's finger pointing, and now heavy regulation that actually is so siloed that it doesn't kind of encompass the whole thing. And we've talked before, if we don't have that right balance, you know, the silo approach can tip things over. So defensive for farming, yes, I am, because I'm not a vegetarian, although, you know, meat has come back, not as much as it used to be. But not only that, you know, our land is our taonga. Our land is our taonga. And so as farmers, you know, our job is, it's not a job. You know, this is a legacy statement that a lot of farming families undertake. And I look forward to the day when, as a Aotearoa New Zealand, we all appreciate things we each do for each other. Because I think some of that has gotten a little bit lost in our climate change korero. It's become very finger pointing, very blame game thing. And so, you know, again, it's a mindset shift. So yes, the agri sector knows that it has to do things different, and it has been for decades. If we could really just explore that further and help that to be more of the conversation, then I think that would take us a long way.
And thank you, Mavis. I love that land is our taonga and we want the best for our mokopuna. Thank you for all the work that you're doing and to show that farming can be regenerative. And by blending Indigenous values and the latest science, we can come up with all sorts of interesting solutions. Project Drawdown has some very interesting work on silviculture and silver pasturing with bovines too, which is just fascinating. And this is another wonderful link into the question that I want to ask Andrea before coming to many of the wonderful questions we have in the chat. Andrea, how can some of those misunderstandings that Mavis highlighted be bridged? And how can we all be better educated on the disruptive change that the climate crisis is creating and how we can take action in positive ways? Just how do you see that leadership gap being bridged?
Yeah, great question. I think the key thing that Mavis is speaking to, it's really important to talk about the behaviour we want to shift, not about blaming bad people, because that's really unhelpful, isn't it? Because we need everyone to be involved, to be part of the mahi of evolving our systems. And basically, I think the world needs more sustainability leaders. And you might think I mean more sustainability managers, but actually the people who are coming to our sustainability leadership program have many different titles. They're chief executives, GMs, head of risk, health and safety, operations, all sorts of functions, because sustainability is becoming embedded across the organisation. And how can people, I was thinking, what's the relevance for the audience in this conversation? And some are global women members and many are not. You can be a sustainability leader by asking great questions of your own organisation. Questions like, what are the global trends and what might whack us? what are the implications? What's our shifting, evolving stakeholder expectations and how might we need to evolve our organisation? Or do we need to refresh our core purpose and strategy of our organisation to take a broader view? Or how might we embed sustainability approaches, not just expect it all of one function, but embed it across our entire organisation? How might we work with our supply chain to advance sustainability? Or how might we unleash the creative potential of our employees to make progress on sustainability? Because some huge advances in organisations are made by people who don't even have the title sustainability manager. They're people like all of us in this environment who care. That's why we're all attracted to this korero. And they say, up with this, I will not put, and I'm going to do something about it. So the world needs more sustainability leaders. I'll put a link into our program to see if that's of interest to anyone, but start by asking provocative questions in your organisation and system. That's my invitation.
We love it. Up with this, I will not put being a sustainability leader by asking great questions. And thank you all so much. We have some incredible questions in the chat. Firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge Diane, who had to join a little late and whose question was around changing the obsession with the current world economic model, where success is measured by more GDP, increasing profits, increasing growth, and doing less is seen by failure. And Diane, Caralee did a fabulous job explaining the framework that the Treasury is taking with the well-being budget, along with a number of other countries in the world. So we will make sure that the link is available so you can watch that replay of Caralee speaking to that. We also have another question for Caralee from Dawn Hutchison, who says, a third of food produced is lost or wasted from farm to fork. And in the US, it's 40%. We have an opportunity in New Zealand to lead the world in sustainable food production and prevent food from being wasted. Tackling food waste will lead to triple wins, environmentally, economically, and socially. What is the Treasury doing with regards to pressuring the Ministry of Environment to set national food waste targets? Caralee.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks so much, Dawn, for that question. Look, earlier this year, Treasury we refreshed our strategic plan, and one of our top priorities is to lean in, work in partnership with other agencies on some of the big issues, long-standing challenges that face New Zealand, including climate change. So we're actively working with the Ministry for Environment and indeed other agencies and collaborating on advice, particularly now around government's emissions reductions plan. We know that waste is one of the contributors to carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, and I absolutely agree with your statement that there are bigger implications. It is that triple impact of environment, economy, and society. So in our work on the emissions reduction plan with MFE and others, we are really looking at that, how we set targets, how we motivate change, how we track, how we monitor. I'm a big believer in what gets measured gets managed. And so by shining the light on where the problems are, we're more likely to mobilise action for change. So I'm not able to speak to exactly where the work is now around waste targets, but I do want to assure you we are actively engaged with MFE and others around waste and then more broadly issues around climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Caralee, and we love that what gets measured gets managed. I just wanted to tell a little follow-up story to that because as Florence pointed out earlier, there are so many business opportunities in addressing climate change, and we are part of an initiative called the We Empower United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Challenge, which New Zealand Global Women is actively involved in as well. And the WE stands for Women Entrepreneurs. A couple of years ago, one of the awardees for the North American region was a tech entrepreneur who had started a business that on a tech app linked the food waste that restaurants and hotels were needing to get rid of and to pay to send it to landfill. She linked them to volunteers who were needing food to help the 1 in 6 Americans who is currently food poor, and it's increased during COVID, by linking those to nonprofit organizations. And she literally has tens of thousands of volunteers. And when you look at an Uber or a Lyft response rate, you can see that the food rescue hero rate is like 99.7%. So it's just a fabulous, very creative social entrepreneurial business model that is stopping methane from food waste and landfills, and she's measuring that, and at the same time is providing NGOs with food for people who would otherwise go hungry, and it's saving money for the businesses that would otherwise have to pay for the food to be taken away to landfill. So these creative social kind of responses are also great business opportunities as well. So seeing here, there's a question from Ronnie Cooper in the chat. Can any of the panel comment on the climate change factors in New Zealand buildings, both in the embedded carbon and the lifetime costs of heating, etc.? New Zealand building code is way lower than international codes for insulation and green tech. Wow, I did not know that, Ronnie, but that is great to know. If we could ask one of the, there we go, Andrea. Oh, please feel free.
So I can't give a thorough answer in the amount of time we have available, but basically there is a construction sector accord, and I was fortunate enough to facilitate the environment work stream of that accord, which is looking at how to transform the environmental impacts of the construction sector. And as part of that, I was also shocked to learn that 50% of New Zealand's waste to landfill comes from the construction sector. It's shockingly wasteful, as well as embodied carbon and operational carbon. But you'll be pleased to know that there is work being done in this space, and a roadmap is being shaped up, at least for the next 10 years. So work has been done. So check out the Construction Sector Accord. There's an interim report, and there will be an ultimate report coming out fairly soon in that space.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. Very helpful. And I'm seeing another question from Mel Hewitson. Hi, Mel. Great to see you. I applaud Treasury's work and welcome incoming TCFD reporting legislation. On the subject of interconnectedness, there's increasing focus internationally on another existential element of the E in ESG, which is nature, and the need for increased focus on halting biodiversity decline. And we are in the 6th great mass extinction. How can we catalyze action on this critical kaupapa, especially in the run-up to the big biodiversity convention in Kunming? Anyone like to take a stab at that one?
I might just say a couple of things quickly. I'm not an expert on biodiversity, but we certainly have people in the team who are really actively engaged with discussions with our counterparts in other agencies. I mean, it's a pretty live issue when we think about emissions pricing, and that's an area that Treasury's been engaged in quite closely, where depending on your carbon price, you can set quite different incentives for afforestation. But one of the easier ways to have afforestation is to plant Pinus radiata, and that has quite different impacts for biodiversity compared with some of our native forestry. And so that's one of the things that we are looking at within Treasury now. The Climate Change Commission has written about that. It's an area of there's been lots of commentary about it. So these are the really important questions about how you design the details of schemes to make sure that you set the incentives in a way that can not just reduce carbon emissions, but think more broadly about other objectives like biodiversity. So I think that's a great question. I mean, the other way in which we're trying to look at this question within the Treasury is to build up some measures of natural capital. There's been some great work that's been done in the UK, which does try to quantify the value of natural capital. Now that's not an easy thing to do, or even to kind of conceptualize how do you quantify something that's so inherently valuable. But again, with that view that what gets measured gets managed, I think there's a real risk that if we don't start to recognize the value of this natural wealth, that we won't be able to protect it as well as we should.
Amanda, if I could just add something to that as well. Thanks for that, Caralee, and good to know that it is under the spotlight, because it does have, some of this carbon farming policy has put our biodiversity at risk, and we see big swaths where forestry, Pinus radiata, has been planted. And I mean, there's places where it absolutely should be, but there's other places where it absolutely shouldn't be. And it not only affects biodiversity of the whenua and the ngahere, but it affects the biodiversity of the community. And, so there's some multiple whacks that go on when there's, and I'm going to be generous to say some of these unintended consequences arrive from some of this policy. So nice that it's being looked at. Kia ora.
Yeah. Kia ora, Mavis. I think that's such a great point. And I know one of the New Zealand Global Women members, Susan Craig, who won the Sustainable Business of the Year and the Preserving Nature Award last year, has had the same issue. She's like, I've planted almost 500,000 native trees, and yet I get better rewarded for a stand of pine plantation instead of bringing back biodiversity. So it's wonderful to hear that Caralee and I'm sure Minister Shaw are working on this. It's more complex, but because what does get measured matters, being able to come up with a framework to manage that complexity is great. So there's a couple more questions. Michelle Embling, lovely to see you. Natural capital, refer to the work and roadmap by Toitu Tahua, the Centre for Sustainable Finance, and the TCFD being the first step that the XRB is taking with reporting standards. So that's very helpful. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And I wanted now to move to a bigger question from Jackie Oldham, which I think is probably one for you, Andrea. My daughter does economics at college. I was horrified to see the syllabus is the same as when I learned economics 30 years ago. How can we make changes and encourage our educators to introduce broader thinking, models, and framework beyond GDP, supply, and demand? Such a critical question. Thank you, Andrea.
It's a huge question. And I think a great place to go to is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics. It's an unfortunate name, but it's a great model. It basically is that society, we need a flourishing society, and we need to live in a safe operating space within planetary boundaries. And it's a rethink of traditional economics. And it really does challenge a lot of the profit, greed is good, profit at all costs, growth at all costs mindset. How to get that into the curriculum that would involve influencing the Ministry of Education. I think they're doing a rethink of the curriculum currently, and there's supposed to be a new history curriculum and so on coming out next year. I'm not sure if economics is in the frame, but it should be. It's a great question. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to add a little to that. When I met philanthropist Julie Wrigley, who I'm now working with, she said to me that her $100 million endowment had gone to create a sustainable dimension in every part of the university. And she had gone to Stanford and become an environmental lawyer and wanted to give the first 100 million to Stanford. And they said, oh no, we couldn't possibly embed sustainability in everything we do. But she met Michael Crow, who was starting a new experiment in a public enterprise university. And he said, absolutely, we should be doing that, with the result that 140,000 students are now all graduating with a sustainability competency, which has a multiplier impact on the way in which they go out into the world. And it's fascinating to see that something like 96% of graduates have a job within the first few months, because it is so in demand from people recognizing this shift. So thank you for that wonderful question, Jackie. Question from Kanika, and this is, do you think the government focus on carbon and climate change has left a lot to be desired in a much larger sustainability sense?
Well, it might not surprise you. I won't be commenting on government policy as in my role at the Treasury. We're advising on government policy. We're not evaluating it. I guess I would just come back to the point that sustainability is a broad concept, and we need to look at all different aspects of it. Environment and climate change within environment is critical, but then we also need to take into account social capital, human capital, and more traditional measures of income and wealth. And as Mavis said at the start, we need to surface the tensions between those different, sometimes competing objectives, and that's what we try and do in the Treasury. At times there are complements, there are ways in which you can support the economy and support the environment at the same time, and at times there are really tough choices that need to be made. And for me, what's important is that we have transparency around that and encourage vigorous debate across the community, so that we do get ministers making outcomes that the public is happy with.
Yeah, it might be easier for someone like me and Mavis to comment on.
I'm on in, team.
We find, as members of the Sustainable Business Council, business is often leading businesses are leading the government, really, and that is the license to operate space, right? So there's often an experience of people in leading private sector organisations that they're dragging the government forward, and because government's waiting for a massive public opinion. So how can we all move the government forward is by voting in the direction we want, but also by supporting our businesses to lead the way visibly, so that there's that that space for the government to accelerate its reaction.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I prefer just to go straight to the question. And Kānaka, for me, the answer is yes. I think that the unintended consequences probably, you know, these things go with best intent, eh? That's where it starts. It all comes from a good place. But there's when you take those silos and address them like that, you're gonna have all these unintended consequences. And until we start to really try to be a lot broader, you know, this is going to be a continuing challenge that we will live with.
And Mavis, that is a perfect note for me to raise the final question from Rebecca Kane, which, Rebecca, will need to be the focus of a future Impact Series webinar. What gets measured gets managed, but Scope 3 emissions are a challenge to measure, making reduction targets more an art than a science. Is there any support for all to disclose Scope 1 and 2, making disclosure of Scope 3 much easier for all companies? So I think a great question, Rebecca, that we will come back to you on in another webinar. And it is my great pleasure on your behalf to thank our brilliant panelists and to leave you with a few thoughts: the importance of a holistic approach, the importance of a grounding in Indigenous values, and the notion particularly of kaitiakitanga across generations. As Caralee recently said, surfacing the tensions, and I think Mavis drew that out beautifully as well, in how do we have those conversations and how do we collaborate. And the last word from Andrea on we're all able to be great sustainability leaders by asking great questions. And so that's the note on which I would leave everybody, and to say a huge thank you to our brilliant panelists today, and to Megan, Agnes, and all of the wonderful team from New Zealand Global Women. Thank you all. We look forward to the next in the Impact Series. Kia ora.